Hi everyone, my name's Jim Mussell and my paper is entitled Trading in Death, Dickens' Ephemerality and the Mid-19th Century Periodical Press. Now, I originally proposed this paper for ESPRit last year with an eye to a chapter I was writing for a book published by Forschergruppe, journal literature, called Reading Miscellanies, Miscellaneous Readings, Interrelations between Medial Formats, Novel Structures and Reading Practices in the 19th century. However, I'm also using this material for a chapter of my own book. I want to take it on and do something slightly different with it. So I thought it was just worth revisiting some of it for this paper for ESPRit this year. But just to say, there is a version of this paper coming out in print shortly. So, Trading in Death was an article by Charles Dickens published in Household Words as the leading article in Household Words on Saturday, the 27th November 1852, and in it Dickens attacked the tawdry commercialism that accompanied the state funeral for the Duke of Wellington. For Dickens, the state funeral was a relic from a more barbarous time. It erected, according to Dickens, a system of barbarous, this is a quote, a system of barbarous show and expense above the grave, associating, and I quote, the most solemn of human occasions with unmeaning mummeries, dishonest debt, profuse waste, and bad example in an utter oblivion of responsibility. The state funeral for Wellington was arranged for 2 months after his death, and according to Dickens, this allowed plenty of time to revive what he calls this general trading spirit and to establish, and I quote again, this public fair and great undertaker's jubilee over his remains. We earnestly submit to our readers, Dickens writes, that there is and that there never can be no kind of honour in such a revival, that the more truly great the man, the more truly little the ceremony, and that it has been from first to last a pernicious instance and encouragement of the demoralizing practice of trading in death. Now, in its attack on the commercialization of commemoration, Trading in Death expressed a broader anxiety of how to remember. Dickens didn't worry about commemorating the Duke. As a national hero, his legacy was secure, but rather he was worried about the way the Duke's memory was being exploited by various dubious purveyors of goods and services in the here and now. And so, to condemn this exploitative commercial activity, he recorded their advertisements. And he sourced these from the Times newspaper and said that's where they came from in the article. He organised the advertisements into 3 categories. First of all, there were seats and refreshments, and this was adverts from people advertising spaces from which to view the funeral and, of course, to be seen viewing the funeral. He then divided out or picked out examples of what he called autographs, which were basically letters by Wellington. And the closer the letter was associated to something in Wellington's life, the more valuable that signature, that letter, became. And the final category was autographs. It was relics. And these were items associated with the Duke. And in the case of pieces of his hair, literally pieces of the Duke. Crucially, Dickens didn't just capture the content of the advertisements, but as I think you can see on the slide, he also reproduced their typographical arrangement. And so they stand out, even though they're printed in the same typeface as other Household Words content, they're presented as if they're from somewhere else. And they're instantly recognizable as newspaper advertisements, appearing where they shouldn't be. By reproducing the typographical appearance of the advertisements, Dickens was doing more than just recording these specific advertisements. He was also recording the genre of the newspaper advertisement, and so the newspaper column too. Now, printing creates a record as it makes a copy. And in my paper, I want to use trading in death to illustrate how print is caught between two archival economies. On the one hand, printing keeps matter present by making lots of copies, spreading them far and wide, whether as standalone publications or as reprints in new contexts. On the other hand, however, just one copy might be kept somewhere safe, somewhere apart, so that it constitutes a record. And this latter economy, of course, is the logic of the archive. Trading in death takes content that exists in a genre more associated with copying, the ephemeral newspaper advertisement, and places it in another, the weekly periodical article, which can be bound up, indexed, and archived. But Dickens was doing more than just preserving ephemeral newspaper content by printing it in a print genre more amenable to retrospective reading. By maintaining the appearance of the advertisements, Trading in Death archived the ephemeral everyday, the rich texture of the present that must make way for the backward glance of history. Maurice Rickards usefully describes print ephemera as the minor transient documents of everyday life. As a class of materials, print ephemera are notoriously hard to define. When it comes to genre, I prefer to think about what things do rather than what they are. Transient, documents, everyday life, ephemera make things happen. They're by definition supplementary, the matter that sustains social existence but doesn't in itself matter. They belong to that class of material that is discarded, left behind, so that we can move on. Yet the link with the passing moment makes ephemera distinctly attractive. Canny producers of printed ephemera have long exploited this connection to encourage people to keep and reuse and pass on their materials. And, connected to a moment now gone, ephemera make great souvenirs. But my point is that they make such great souvenirs because they remain, partially and inadequately, of the moment that's gone. Ephemera have an affective charge because they remind us of everything else that we have to forget. Ephemera belong to the dead. Now, like all open-ended serials, newspapers and periodicals have one foot in ephemerality. As each issue is allocated its period of time, it writes past, present and future from that moment, and that moment alone. But not all issues are the same. The current issue is the only one yet to be displaced, the only one for whom the future has not yet been written. When its successor appears, it joins its predecessors, another record of a moment past, another record of an imagined future that has not come to pass. Archives of provisional presents, then, with their own futures and pasts, serials are invaluable historical documents. Yet British newspapers and periodicals of the 19th century went in separate directions. Newspapers abandoned volume numbers and continuous pagination, disregarding the possibility that they might be bound up and consulted by readers in the future. Periodicals, though, clung to such features, and they did so firmly that they became a generic marker of periodicalness. Now, earlier I suggested that print exists in two archival economies, one based on copying and one based on keeping. And we can see how newspapers and periodicals situated themselves increasingly in these two separate economies. It's in this context that I want to place Trading in Death. In this article, Dickens exploited household words' position within this archival economy, within these archival economies, to gather up and store otherwise ephemeral material from the newspaper. By turning miscellaneous advertisements into subject matter for an article, he lent them coherence while binding them up within household words' volumes. In other words, he made them archival records. Yet by reprinting them, attending to both what the advertisement said and how they said it, Dickens exploited that other way that print remembers. Printing was a way to leave a mark on a piece of paper that could perhaps be stored somewhere, sure, but it also made things move. But Trading in Death was an attempt to record the ephemeral, not to better remember the Duke. As I said, as a national hero, his legacy was secure, but to remember how the Duke was being misremembered in the moment. The article was written, says Dickens, the night before the funeral. He blamed, and I quote, the mechanical exigencies of the journal for having to send it off before the event. So it meant he couldn't report on the spectacle, he couldn't report on the crowds that would line the street, the massive funeral car teetering along the road, with its halberds that could be mechanically lowered so it could go past beneath the gate of Temple Bar, or indeed the funeral ceremony in St. Paul's. Instead, his focus was on the build-up, the ephemeral transient details soon to be swept away by the memory of the event itself. The reprinted advertisements were in the same face as the rest of the content of Household Words, but they sufficiently reproduced the look of the Times to make them instantly recognisable. At this period, the Times was notorious for its advertisements. It printed between 1,700 and 3,000 advertisements a day, and they were rumoured to generate between £300,000 to £400,000 a year, much more than it could generate from sales revenue alone. And as you can see, it's a dense, complex page with no headings at all, but there was an underlying grammar. As the same advertisements appeared in the same place, issue by issue, readers soon got to learn where particular types of advertisements could be found. And Matthew Rubery has written interestingly on this in his book on newspapers and the novel. But the rhythm of the page too functioned as a guide for readers. The genre of the advertisement, as well as the constraints on space, created repetition. And as the first few words were picked out in capital letters, and the first letter was picked out with a dropped cap, similar advertisements looked the same. There was lots of redundancy on the advertising pages of the Times, but this allowed readers to navigate this complex page. And I think this is really well brought out by the example on the right-hand side of the slide, all these wanted ads that start with the word wanted and then identify the thing that is wanted. It's this distinctive look, this distinctive texture that Dickens reproduced in the pages of Household Words. There's a risk, though, isn't there, in reproducing advertisements. They are already highly mobile. They're the most promiscuous of texts, and reprinting them risks giving away free advertising space. Dickens's solution? Likely editing the advertisements to diffuse them as advertisements. Now, using the Times Digital Archive, it's fairly easy to find the advertisements, the original advertisements that Dickens has reprinted in Household Words. Let me give you some examples. So the first one is the first advertisement here, Ludgate Hill. So here's the original appearance of this advertisement in the Times, and you can see that Dickens has taken out the title and the number of the property that's being advertised. So he's taken out the funeral of the Duke of Wellington and 30. He's also taken out the details at the end of the advertisement, A. Whitmore, Osborne House, 30 Ludgate Hill City. So he's taken out the details of the property being advertised and the details of the person doing the advertising. Just as an aside, I don't think Dickens was making a deliberate decision to take out the titles of advertisements because he keeps the others as they are. And I think he does this to preserve that characteristic repetition, that characteristic redundancy of the newspaper advertising column. So if you look at the right-hand column here, you get funeral of the late Duke of Wellington, funeral of the Duke of Wellington, the Duke's funeral, etc., etc. Dickens did a similar thing with the advertisements, illustrating those other categories of advertisements, autographs and relics. Let me give you an example of those. So here's the page of Household Words of Trading in Death that shows the autographs and the relics, or the first two of the relics. And here you can find many of these advertisements, not only in the same issue of the Times, but also the same column. So let me show you that. So there's three of the advertisements for autographs. As you can see, they're from the same portion of this column from the issue of the Times on the 15th of November 1852. And there's the first one of the relics, memento of the late Duke of Wellington, and it's a lock of his hair. But what I want to focus on here is the appearance of these reprinted advertisements in the context of Household Words. As Dickens ends the excerpt, he remarks, and I quote, that they might easily have been extended through the whole of the present number of this journal. His point is that there are many from which he could have chosen, but I think he gestures to something significant about this type of content. Advertisements are usually marked as other, as coming from somewhere else. And in the case of Household Words, this is particularly marked because Household Words didn't carry any advertisements in its weekly issues. So these ones really stand out. They stand out typographically too. This is how Trading in Death ends, and it allows us to see what articles usually look like in Household Words. And it's this kind of unrelenting two columns of letterpress. So the exerted advertisements in their white space really pop out the page. But what I want to suggest is that not only do advertisements look like they come from somewhere else, but that somewhere else is also a kind of nowhere. Advertisements usually feature names and addresses, ascribing origins to each advertisement. Advertisers need their goods to be distinct from other goods advertised in other adverts, and consumers need to know where to go in order to get the goods. But the promiscuity of advertisements, their ubiquitousness, appearing in the same place issue after issue perhaps, or appearing in lots of different places, give advertisements a kind of anonymity, as if they were all instances of a type of something, and as if they just appeared magically and mysteriously. While Dickens's point is that there are many from which to choose, I think he also tacitly admits the promiscuity of advertisements and the nowhere that's created through difference. Too many advertisements and Household Words might begin to resemble the Times. Too many advertisements, and there would be neither Household Words nor Times at all. By including advertisements within the article, they become part of the indexed content of Household Words. Household Words issued an index along with the other matter for binding with the last issue of the volume, and Household Words' volumes were 6 monthly. Readers could either bind up their weekly issues, they could also bind monthly issues and bind them up, or they could buy a ready bound volume from the publishers, which was the most expensive way to obtain a volume of Household Words. Now in the index is organised quite straightforwardly with one major division. They separate out all the poetry. Entries in the index are identified by their title, which stands as a surrogate for their subject matter, and they're picked out by the first substantive word in the title. Sometimes a second, they appear again under the second, but there's no attempt to pick out the most significant words. Trading in Death, as such, appears under trading. Now, this index entry was unlikely to be of much use to anybody, but it does show how these once ephemeral newspaper advertisements have become incorporated as part of this eminently archivable form. There was, of course, the chance that they would become lost again, one article badly indexed in a single volume of a long run of a periodical, itself one of tens of thousands of publication. But by being subject to Dickens's discourse, incorporated into a book-like form and labelled in an index, they were reconceived as now being for readers to come. Catherine Waters has remarked on the way the letters and the relics in particular gain their value because of their tangible connection with the body of the dead Duke. Wellington might be gone, but these ephemeral objects have persisted despite themselves, the growing gap between them and the Duke providing space for fantasies of national glory predicated on his remains. By exerting the advertisements, Dickens subjected them to the same grim resurrectionist economy. As Waters points out, Dickens was deeply implicated in 19th century commodity culture, using his name to sell his periodical and his periodical to sell his books. She also shows how Dickens himself traded in death, writing about it in other contributions to Household Words, and of course featuring it, exploiting it for sentimental or for shocking ends in his novels. Yet by reprinting the advertisements from the newspaper in the pages of his weekly magazine, Dickens was trading in death in another way too. Ephemera are of the present and intended to pass with it. By exerting the advertisements, trying to memorialise what should be forgotten, Dickens attempted to store up and archive the past in all its richness. Not everything can be remembered, however, and history is made from just such miscellaneous remains. Thank you.